The Holy Gospel according to Luke. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father,
"Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me."
So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. And there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place in the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said,
"How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am, dying from hunger. I will get up and I will go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired hands.'
So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. And then his son said to him,
'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.'
But the father said to his slaves,
Quickly, get a robe and put it on me. And get sandals for his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it. For we must eat and celebrate. For this son of mine who was dead is now alive. He was lost and now is found.
and they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied,
"Sir, your brother has returned. Your father has killed the fatted calf because your son has returned safe and sound."
Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father,
"Listen, all these years I've worked like a slave for you, and I've never disobeyed your command. And yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came home, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him."
Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we came to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours who was dead is alive again. He was lost and now is found.
the Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Perspectives matter and influence the way we respond to situations. Our gospel reading is a very familiar reading to us, the prodigal son. Depends on who reads it, really. Depends on what kind of perspective you would get, depending on your background. I would imagine if you are an older brother or sister, you might want to change the title of the prodigal son to something like really ticked off older brother. Or little brother gets off easy again. Well, I suppose if you are a younger brother or sister, you might want to change the common title of the prodigal son as well. You might want to change it to something like, older brother thinks life is not fair. Or maybe even jealous and self-righteous brother. Our perspectives influence the way in which we interpret the Bible, the way in which we live our lives, the way in which we see our lives and the world around us. Another title of the prodigal son that I've heard is A Community Failed. This title came up during a Bible study. My friend Elliot from Tanzania said that he can't get over the fact that a community would not help this younger son who is in trouble, would actually let him eat the food of pigs. In his community, it's a sin if you do not bring in a brother or sister of anyone who comes into your community. If you don't help them, it's a sin. He said, as he continued, he said, it isn't acceptable to judge others. What is acceptable is to serve others, no matter what. Mark Allen Powell did a study on this story, the prodigal son, and asked the questions, why did the prodigal son end up where he did? He discovered in different areas and countries of the world, there was a different response. In Russia, the answer to the question, why did the prodigal son end up where he did, was famine. In Africa, the answer was nobody helped him. In North America, where we live, the answer was he squandered or he wasted his living. Perspectives matter and influence how we make sense of the Bible, our faith, and our lives. On Mondays, we're having Holy Communion class with parents and children and youth, and some of the students and children have had First Communion and some have not. Last Monday, the group learned about grace as Pastor Paul taught about the Israelites and the manna that came down from heaven. He asked the question, did the Israelites have to pay for the manna, or did they have to earn the manna? The class learned that manna was a gift from God, and they did not have to pay for it or earn it. And just as the manna was a gift from God, Christ's love and forgiveness is a gift to us as we receive Holy Communion. Monday's class and discussion about grace reminded me of a story of two other brothers. These brothers are Tom and my sons, Aaron and Mitchell. Aaron received his First Communion at First United Lutheran Church in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Aaron took 4 communion classes. He made a chalice, and he went to a special service designed for First Communion students. Mitchell, on the other hand, received the communion in a different way. We were in transition to seminary, and as we visited the different congregations in the area, we discovered that it would be a very, very long time before Mitchell would receive communion. So on a random Sunday, while our family was attending Lord of Life Lutheran Church in Asbury, Iowa, I asked Mitchell if he would like to receive communion as we sat in the pews. He said yes. I then asked him, what does communion mean to you? And he replied, Christ's forgiveness. Wonderful. So I said, okay, and I taught him how to hold his hands, and he proceeded to have communion for the first time. When we got back home for our Sunday meal, Aaron sat down and took a deep breath and said, that's not fair. Referring to Mitchell receiving communion without having the classes and the special service and making the chalice as he did. I immediately replied to Aaron saying, tell me, from what you've learned from communion, why do you think it's not fair for Mitchell to receive communion? Aaron was silent. And then he said, oh yeah, That's right. Lent is a time for us to admit our own perspectives and to be open to new perspectives. It's a time to own our own brokenness and our own need for God's grace, love, and forgiveness. I think Lent helps us to see the lostness of all the characters in the story of the prodigal son. The lostness of the younger son who thought that being independent and free would make him happy. The lostness of the older son who thought being the best worker and the hardest worker would give him wholeness and acceptance. Lent helps us to see when we think of only ourselves. Lent helps us to see that when we want independence, sometimes that disconnects us from our community. Lent helps us to see our true motivations from our own actions and our true motivations from our own apologies. Lent helps us to see the story of the prodigal son and our own longing for belonging, our longing to be forgiven, and our longing to be loved. Christ loves us for who we are. Christ does not love one of us more than the other. We say this over and over again in church, but it seems it takes us time for that to sink in and we forget. We learn from extraordinary father's perspective in the prodigal son that there is nothing, not one thing, that will separate his love for his sons. Pure grace. As the younger son once perceived himself as lost, with a fate worse than death, he now can proclaim a faith that is greater than life itself in living with the knowledge that he is now found. We also are found in Christ. Christ's perspective is a perspective of grace. It's a perspective that has changed the world and continues to change the world. It's a perspective that breaks down walls. It's a perspective that says refugees are welcome. It's a perspective that sees good when no one else can see good. And it's a perspective that challenges us to see hope in a world that sees darkness, self-centeredness, and death. As we continue in this Lent journey, may we be open to Christ's renewing perspective in our lives, in our country of unsettled politics, and in our suffering world. And may we hold on to the perspective of the welcoming Father's open arms that say nothing, not one thing will separate you from the love of God. And for this we say, thanks be to God. Amen.